The moment Clara Hutchins stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, with a carpetbag in one hand and a lie already forming on her lips, she had no intention of staying past the first thaw. The year was 1879, and Caldwell sat on the edge of the Kisham Trail like a man leaning too far over a cliff, raucous, dusty, and convinced of its own permanence. The town smelled of cattle and coal smoke, and the kind of ambition that rarely panned out the way people hoped. Clara had passed through enough towns like this one to know what they were made of. She had grown up in St. Louis, studied enough at the small schoolhouse her father ran to understand the difference between a temporary situation and a permanent one, and she had long since learned to keep her bags only half unpacked. She was 23 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a practical hat, gray eyes that noticed too much, and a firm mouth that smiled more easily than people expected. She carried herself with the quiet composure of someone who had learned early that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving behind a mountain of debt that swallowed everything, including the schoolhouse. Her older sister, Margaret, had married a merchant in Denver and was doing fine. Clara had been too proud to follow her there and had instead taken a position advertised in the St. Louis Dispatch, a schoolteacher needed in Caldwell, Kansas, for the winter term, housing included, salary modest but guaranteed through to the end of April. Spring. That was the arrangement, and Clara had made her peace with it before she even boarded the coach. The town looked up at her with the lazy disinterest of a place too busy surviving to worry about newcomers, and Clara squared her shoulders and walked toward the establishment listed in her hiring letter, the office of one Mr. Elias Boone, town alderman and self-appointed organizer of Caldwell's first proper schoolhouse. She found Mr. Boone to be a round, good-natured man with a walrus mustache and ink perpetually staining his right hand. He shook hers vigorously, introduced her to his wife, offered her a biscuit, and then handed her a set of keys and directions to the small clapboard house 2 blocks east of the schoolhouse that the town had arranged for her to use. "The school building's nothing much," he admitted cheerfully, "but the children are eager. We've got 22 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, and most of them haven't had a teacher for the better part of a year. Old Mr. Pettifer left us last spring for Wichita, and we've been doing what we can with what we have." "I'll manage," Clara told him, because she always did. She walked the 2 blocks to her temporary house in the late afternoon light, unlocked the door, and stood in the small front room that smelled of fresh-cut lumber and cold ash in the fireplace. It was a plain room, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the back corner, a shelf with nothing on it. A single window looked out at the back of another building, and a slice of the winter-pale Kansas sky. She set her carpetbag on the table and did not cry, because she was Clara Hutchins, and crying over temporary circumstances was exactly the sort of thing she did not do. She built a fire instead. She met the cowboy the following morning. His name was Jesse Calhoun, and he was 26 years old, tall and broad-shouldered in the way that men who work outdoors from boyhood tend to be, with dark hair that curled a little at the collar of his coat, and eyes the particular shade of brown that reminded Clara, immediately and irritatingly, of good coffee on a cold morning. He was not handsome in any obvious or theatrical sense. His nose had been broken at some point and had healed slightly crooked. There was a scar running along his left jawline that he never explained to her satisfaction. His hands were large and calloused, and he held his hat when he spoke to women, which was the kind of thing Clara's mother would have called good raising. He was also, it turned out, the man responsible for chopping and delivering firewood to the schoolteacher's house, an arrangement Mr. Boone had mentioned only in passing, and so he appeared at her door at 7 in the morning with an armload of split oak and an expression of mild surprise at finding her already up, already dressed, already standing at the stove with a tin cup of coffee in her hand. "Morning," he said. "You must be the new schoolteacher." "I must be," she agreed, and stepped aside to let him in. He stacked the wood beside the fireplace with the efficient movements of a man who had done this particular task many times. He did not make unnecessary conversation. He did not linger. He was back out the door in 4 minutes, and Clara watched him go with the complete certainty that he was exactly the kind of steady, uncomplicated man she had absolutely no business thinking about. She went to school instead. The schoolhouse was small and cold in the mornings until the stove got going, and the children were everything Mr. Boone had promised, eager in the way that only children who have been starved of something can be, competitive and loud, and occasionally cruel to each other in the unconscious way of the very young. Clara sorted them quickly. She had a gift for this, for seeing the quiet ones who needed drawing out and the loud ones who needed containing, for finding what each child found interesting and using it as a door. Within a week, she had them settled into a rhythm, and within 2 weeks, she had the oldest 3 helping the youngest ones with their letters, which freed her to work with the middle group on arithmetic. In the afternoons, when the last child had gone home, she stayed to prepare the next day's lessons. The schoolhouse had a decent supply of primers and a single shelf of other books that she rationed carefully, letting children borrow one at a time and return it before taking another. The cold settled in hard as November deepened, and she learned to keep her coat on until nearly noon, when the stove finally managed to push enough heat into the room. Jesse Calhoun came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday of the 3rd week. He came not with firewood but with his hat in his hands and a young boy at his side, a boy of about 7 with Jesse's dark hair and none of his composure. The boy looked like he had been crying recently and was working very hard to pretend he hadn't. "This is Thomas," Jesse said, "my nephew. I have custody of him since his mother, my sister, passed in September. He's been resistant to coming to school. I told him the new teacher was very serious and would notice immediately if he fell behind the other children his age, and that seemed to do the trick." Clara looked at the boy. Thomas looked back at her with the particular expression of a child who has been told something to frighten him into cooperation and is currently assessing whether the threat was real. "He's right," Clara said to Thomas, very seriously. "I notice everything." "Can you read any?" "Some," Thomas said, just above a whisper. "Then you're ahead of where I expected. Come in." She did not look at Jesse as she took the boy's hand and led him to a desk. When she glanced at the door a moment later, Jesse was still standing there, hat in both hands, watching his nephew settle into the seat with an expression on his face that had nothing to do with uncomplicated at all. It was the face of a man holding something fragile and being very careful not to show how hard that was. He left before she could think of anything to say. Thomas came back the next morning without being brought, which Clara found both impressive and telling. Children whose home lives were secure did not rush to school. Children for whom school represented the most stable part of their day were always early. She made a mental note and treated him with the same matter-of-fact attention she gave everyone, which was, she had found, exactly what children in complicated circumstances needed most. Jessie was at her door again on Saturday with firewood, and this time she had coffee ready because she had begun to anticipate the 7 o'clock knock, which she found mildly annoying about herself. "He came back on his own," she told him, and watched the relief move across Jessie's face like sunlight across a field. "I didn't expect that," Jessie admitted. "Most parents don't. May I ask how long ago you took him in?" 6 weeks. His mother, my sister Ellen, she got sick fast, fever. By the time I got word she was gone and Thomas was with the neighbors. He said it plainly, without self-pity, which Clara recognized as the particular stoicism of someone who had not yet had time to grieve properly because there was too much else to be done. I run cattle. I've got a small operation, 12 miles north of town. It's no place to raise a child proper, but I'm working on that." "What does he do when you're on the range?" "Mrs. Alderman, she watches him. Hannah Alderman lives on the next property. She's a widow, older woman, very kind. But she's not. Thomas needs more than that." Clara poured him a second cup of coffee without asking if he wanted it, because his cup was empty and it seemed like the practical thing to do. "He's a bright boy," she said. "He'll be fine with structure and someone to answer his questions. He has a great many questions." "He does," Jesse agreed, and something in his voice shifted slightly, like a door opening just a fraction. "He asked me last night what stars are made of, and I told him fire, and he said that didn't seem right because fire needs wood, and where does the wood come from in space?" Clara laughed before she could stop herself. It was a genuine laugh, sudden and unguarded, and Jessie Calhoun looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something between surprise and warmth, and she felt the small, alarming pull of it and set it aside firmly. "He's right to question that," she said. "I'll find him something to read about astronomy. You have something like that out here. I brought a trunk of books on the stagecoach. Half my luggage weight was books. The driver was not pleased." Jesse smiled then properly, and it did rather unfair things to the line of his jaw, broken nose notwithstanding. "What kind of books?" "Everything," she said. "History, natural science, literature. A complete Shakespeare, 2 volumes of Dickens, a botanical guide to the American prairie which seemed practical, and a few novels I'm not prepared to apologize for." "I haven't read a novel since I was about 16, he said. "My mother kept a copy of Jane Eyre. I read it twice, but I always told my friends it was twice by accident." Clara studied him for a moment. "Did you like it?" "I liked that she knew her own mind," he said, and then looked slightly as if he hadn't meant to say it quite like that and picked up his hat from the table. "I should get back. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Hutchins." "Clara," she said, without planning to. He paused at the door. "Jessie," he said, and walked out into the cold November morning. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment after he left, the warm mug between her palms, the lingering presence of an honest conversation still sitting in the room like good light. She thought about the way he had looked at his nephew, that careful, frightened love of a man who had never planned for this and was doing it anyway. She thought about Jane Eyre. She thought, "This is temporary. I am here until spring. I should not be standing in my kitchen, cataloging the qualities of a man I am leaving." She went to plan Monday's lessons. November turned and December arrived with real cold, the kind that came off the open plains like something deliberate, and Caldwell buttoned itself up and hunkered down. The trail drives were long done for the season. The drovers had gone south or spent their wages in town and moved on. What remained was the settled, permanent population, the merchants and their families, the few farmers trying their luck on the edges of town, the ranchers like Jesse who ran small operations and kept things going through the winter with a skeleton crew of ranch hands. Jesse came every Saturday with firewood. This became, without either of them acknowledging it, also an occasion for coffee and conversation that ran anywhere from 20 minutes to, on one occasion, nearly 2 hours, when Clara pulled out a map of the Kansas Territory, and Jesse showed her where the major cattle trails ran, and told her about driving cattle north from Texas the summer before, and she told him about the geography she had studied. And they disagreed pleasantly about the practicality of the homesteaders who kept arriving from the east expecting the plains to behave like the farmland back home. And neither of them noticed the time until Clara's kitchen stove began to run low on wood, and Jesse jumped up to add more and realized it was nearly noon. "I've taken your whole morning," he said, looking genuinely abashed. "I gave it willingly," she said, which was true, which was why she said nothing else after it. Thomas was thriving. This was the word Clara used in her private assessments and the word she used when Jesse asked, because it was accurate. The boy had gone from resistant to enthusiastic in the span of 3 weeks, attaching himself with particular fervor to reading and mathematics, and a deep personal interest in the natural world that Clara fed carefully with her botanical guide, and one of the natural science volumes from her trunk. He asked approximately 40 questions per day, which was more than any of the other children, and he had befriended a girl named Ruth whose father ran the livery stable. and the two of them spent recesses engaged in industrious projects whose purposes were never entirely clear, but always thoroughly explained when Clara inquired. One afternoon in December, Thomas stayed after the other children had left, sitting at his desk with a reader open in front of him, not reading it, turning a small stone over and over in his hands. Clara continued marking papers and waited. "Do you think my uncle is lonely?" Thomas asked finally. Clara considered her answer carefully. "What makes you wonder about that? He works all day, and then in the evenings it's just us, and Mrs. Alderman comes to cook sometimes, but she goes home. And he reads, but I think he is thinking about other things while he is reading because he never remembers what happened in the book when I ask him. That sounds like something on his mind, not necessarily loneliness." Thomas turned the stone over. "He smiles more on Saturdays," he said, "after he comes back from town." Clara put down her marking pencil. "Is that so?" "Ruth says when a man smiles more on Saturdays it means a girl," Thomas said, with the combination of confidence and cluelessness that was distinctive to 7-year-old boys. "Ruth has quite a lot of opinions for someone her age. She learned it from her mother." Thomas finally slid the stone into his pocket and picked up the reader. "I think it would be good if my uncle wasn't lonely. He had someone before, Miss Preston, but she went to Wichita and it didn't work out. He doesn't talk about it, but Mrs. Alderman told me." Clara picked up her pencil. "Thomas, it isn't polite to speculate about the romantic lives of other people. Read your page." Thomas read his page, but he looked satisfied in a way that Clara found distinctly unsettling. Christmas came to Caldwell with a community gathering at the church hall that Clara attended because Mr. Boone invited her with such enthusiasm that refusal would have been unkind. She wore her best dress, dark green wool, and her hair down for the first time in months, and she told herself this was simply because it was a social occasion, and not for any reason specific to the fact that Jesse Calhoun would be there with Thomas, whom she had overheard telling Ruth that his uncle had brushed his coat 3 times before they left. Jesse was there in a clean white shirt and his good coat and the hat he reserved for town occasions, and when he saw her across the room his expression did the thing again, that door-opening thing, and he made his way across the crowded hall with a directness that was, Clara thought, either very flattering or very alarming, possibly both. "You look you're not in your school coat," he said, and then looked mildly appalled at himself. "Very observant," she said. "You've brushed yours." Something flickered in his eyes. 3 times, he admitted, which made her laugh again, and they stood together for the better part of the evening. They ate together, listened together to the fiddler Mr. Guthrie, who played magnificently and knew it, watched Thomas and Ruth stage an elaborate private drama in the corner that involved a lot of whispering and pointing at various adults. Near the end of the evening, standing near the door while others danced, Jesse said quietly, "Thomas is going to be all right. I can see it now. I couldn't when I first brought him home." "He is," Clara agreed. "He's going to be more than all right. He's extraordinary." Jesse looked at her with the full weight of what that meant to him, and did not say anything, because some gratitude runs too deep for the words available. They walked home in the same direction. His wagon was hitched at the end of her street, and the night was bitter cold and completely clear, the Kansas sky dense with stars the way it only got in winter. Thomas walked between them, holding each of their hands, pointing upward and asking whether the stars they could see now were the same ones the ancient Romans had looked at, which Clara confirmed they were, which produced a thoughtful silence that lasted nearly a full block. At her door, Thomas hugged her around the waist, unsolicited, which caught her entirely off guard and produced a thickness in her throat she had not expected. Jessie watched this with that careful look, and when Thomas released her and went a climb into the wagon, Jessie said, "Thank you for all of it." "I'm just doing my job," she said, "because it was safer." He nodded once. His breath made clouds in the cold air. "Good night, Clara. Good night, Jessie." She went inside and sat by her fire for a long time, doing arithmetic of a different kind, counting the weeks until spring, counting what that meant, counting the things she had begun to want that she had not budgeted for. January arrived, and with it, a blizzard that shut Caldwell down for 4 days and left 3 feet of snow in the streets and closed the school until the paths were clear enough for children to navigate. Clara used the time to read, to write letters to her sister Margaret, and to be honest with herself in the way that only enforced solitude makes possible. She was in danger. That was the word she kept arriving at. Not in the dramatic sense. Jessie Calhoun had never been anything but respectful, had never presumed, had never made her feel anything but entirely herself. But that was precisely the problem. She was in danger of wanting to stay, which was the one thing she had specifically promised herself she would not do. She had watched her mother stay in places because of men, watched the way that kind of staying could erode a woman's own geography until she could no longer find herself on the map. Clara's independence was not a pose. It was the thing she had built out of the rubble of her father's death and her family's lost home, and it was real and it was hers. She wrote to Margaret, "I am in a complicated situation." Margaret, who was 7 years older and had made her own complicated choices, wrote back promptly, "Tell me about him." Clara wrote back, "I did not say it was a him." Margaret wrote, "Tell me about him." So she did. She described the firewood and the coffee and Thomas and the Christmas gathering and the walk home through the stars, and when she finished she sat back and read what she had written and understood that she had described, in careful documentary detail, the progression of falling in love with someone, and that knowing this changed nothing about the situation at all. School resumed in the second week of January, and Clara resumed her lessons, and Jessie resumed his Saturday visits. And the difference now was that Clara was aware of everything in a way that was simultaneously wonderful and quietly terrible, aware of the way he listened, head slightly tilted, when she described something she found interesting. Aware of the way he talked about his land, the 12 miles north, the way the creek ran through the east pasture, the particular quality of the light in that part of the prairie in summer. Aware of the way he talked about summer when it was January, as if summer was where he already lived in his mind. One Saturday in mid-January, the conversation arrived somewhere it had not been before. They had been talking about Thomas's progress, and then about books, and then about nothing in particular, the comfortable kind of conversation that wanders because it doesn't need a destination. And then Jessie said, "How long are you contracted for?" Clara set down her mug. She had known this question was coming, had been waiting for it the way you wait for a sound you can hear approaching from a distance. "Through April," she said, "the end of the spring term." Jessie said nothing for a moment. He was looking at his hands around his own mug. And then I haven't decided." This was partially true. She had several options: a position in Denver that Margaret had mentioned, a possible situation in St. Louis with a private family, the general direction of east or west or south, any of which would take her away from Caldwell, Kansas, which had always been the plan. "I said I was only staying until spring," she added, because she felt he deserved the honest version. Jessie nodded. It was a slow nod, a nod that contained something being adjusted internally. "Makes sense," he said. "It's not much of a town to settle in permanent." "It's not nothing," Clara said, and then immediately wondered why she had. He looked at her. "No," he agreed, "it's not nothing." They sat in a silence that was loaded with too many things for either of them to pick up and carry without help, and then Jessie said, "I should get back. Thomas'll be wanting lunch." He left, and Clara began consciously to count the days to spring. It was not a happy counting. It was the kind of arithmetic that tells you something you don't want to know, the way subtracting days from a fixed number only ever produces a smaller number, and the number at the end is 0. February arrived. On a Tuesday evening, Clara was walking home from school later than usual when she passed the Caldwell Saloon, which she normally avoided as a matter of practicality rather than moral judgment, and heard raised voices that resolved, as she paused on the boardwalk, into an argument between a ranch hand she didn't recognize and a man she did, old Calvin Dre, who owned a small farm to the south of town, and who was, by the evidence before her, being accused of something with considerable volume and aggression. She might have continued walking, because this was the kind of thing that happened in saloon proximity and was rarely as serious as it sounded, except that Calvin Dre was 64 years old, and the ranch hand was half that age and considerably larger, and Calvin appeared to be genuinely frightened. Clara walked through the saloon door, which was not something respectable women did in 1879 in Caldwell, Kansas, and stood in the entrance until the room noticed her, which took approximately 3 seconds. "Mr. Dre," she said, into the sudden quiet, "I believe your wife was looking for you at the general store." Calvin Dre, who was a widower and therefore had no wife, grasped the situation immediately with the instincts of the very old and very sensible. "So she was," he said, and extracted himself from the ranch hand's vicinity with impressive dignity. Clara held the door until he was through it and then followed him out, and behind her she could hear the saloon exhaling back into normal noise. Calvin gripped her arm on the boardwalk and said, "Much obliged, Miss Hutchins. I owe you a debt." "You owe me nothing," she said, and walked him to the corner and made sure he was headed in a safe direction before she continued home. She was nearly to her door when she heard quick boots behind her and turned to find Jesse, slightly out of breath, coat unbuttoned despite the cold. "I was on my way to the saloon," he said, which told her he had heard what happened, because Caldwell was small and information moved fast. "Calvin got to me first. He told me what you did." "It was a minor thing," she said. "Walking into the Caldwell saloon alone to defuse a situation is not a minor thing," Jesse said. He was looking at her with something that was past admiration, something that had an edge to it, an intensity that he usually kept under careful management. "It could have gone badly." "It didn't," she said. "Clara," he said her name like it was the period at the end of a very long sentence, like it was the word that summed everything up. She looked at him there on the February street in the cold dark, and the space between them was small and the moment was very large, and she understood that they were at the edge of something and that going over it was going to make counting the days considerably harder. "Jesse," she said quietly, and let the distance close. He kissed her with the careful reverence of a man who has been thinking about this for a long time and is aware of the exact weight of the moment. It was not a long kiss. It was the kind of kiss that is really a question, and she answered it without pretending she didn't know what she was answering. When they separated, the night was still cold and the stars were still there and nothing in Caldwell had changed, but something between them had clicked into a new configuration, like a compass needle finding north. "I know what you said," he told her, "about spring." "I know you know," she said. "I'm not asking you to change anything," he said. I needed you to know that this isn't nothing for me. You're not nothing." She thought about her mother. She thought about staying. She thought about the careful architecture of her independence. She thought about Thomas asking if his uncle was lonely and the fact that she had the answer, had had it for weeks. "I know," she said, and meant it in the most complex way language allows. She went inside and he went back to his wagon and she sat by her fire and counted. 2.5 months to spring. What happened next was that they began, without discussing it, to spend more time together. Not recklessly. They were both careful people. Careful in different ways, but careful. But in the way of two people who have acknowledged something and find no reason to pretend otherwise. He came on Saturdays for firewood, but he also came on Thursday evenings with Thomas, and she would have dinner ready, which she told herself was efficient because she was cooking for herself anyway. And they would eat together, and Thomas would do his schoolwork at the table while the adults talked. And on those evenings, Jessie always looked at her at some point across the supper table with an expression of such unguarded contentment that she had to look at her plate. The town noticed, because towns always do, and Mrs. Boone said warmly to Clara that she was so glad their schoolteacher had found pleasant company, which was Caldwell's way of blessing the arrangement without intruding on it. Old Calvin Dre tipped his hat to her every time he saw her, and once left a jar of preserved plums on her doorstep with no note, which she understood was a thank you in the currency of the very stoic. Thomas, for his part, behaved as if this development was completely expected and mildly overdue, which was both endearing and transparent. He had taken to calling her Miss Clara outside of school, which the other children immediately copied, and Ruth had informed him gravely that this was a sign of affection, which Thomas had relayed to Clara with the confidence of a diplomat reporting successful negotiations. One Thursday evening in late February, Thomas fell asleep over his books at the table, which he occasionally did when the stove was warm enough, and Jessie carried him to the small settee in the corner and covered him with Clara's spare blanket, and then the two adults sat by the fire in the particular quiet of a sleeping child nearby, which is its own kind of intimacy. "Tell me about before Kansas," Jessie said. She told him about St. Louis and her father's schoolhouse, and the smell of chalk and old paper that she had grown up in, and the way her father could make any subject come alive in 20 minutes flat, and how she had understood from very early that teaching was the work she was meant for. She told him about her mother, who had been beautiful and restless and had died when Clara was 15, and about the way her father had seemed to lose a piece of his engine after that, still working, still caring, but quieter. She told him about the debt and the lost school and the necessity of the job listing in the dispatch. Jessie listened through all of it with the full attention he gave everything, and when she finished he said, "You built yourself out of things that would have knocked a lot of people down. People knock down and get back up," she said. "That's just what people do. Some do it better than others." He was quiet a moment. "My father drank," he said, like he was putting something on the table to be looked at. "He wasn't a mean drunk, which is what everyone said as if that made it better, just absent. My mother kept the ranch together, raised me and Ellen both, ran everything. Ellen got out young, married at 19, and went east with her husband, and then he died, and she came back with Thomas and worked hard, and then she got sick, and now Thomas is mine." He said this with a flat steadiness that cost him something. "I don't talk about this much." "I know," she said. "I can tell. I'm telling you because," he stopped, looked at the fire, "because you told me real things and I wanted to give you real things back." Clara felt the fire's warmth and the weight of genuine honesty and the tender danger of this man who was sitting in her house being exactly himself, and she thought, "I am in so much trouble." "Thank you," she said simply. He smiled at his boots. "Don't thank me, I'm terrified." "Of what?" He looked at her then directly. "Of you leaving." She did not tell him she wasn't going to because she didn't know that yet, and he deserved honesty more than comfort. She said, "I'm not gone yet," and then because that wasn't enough, "and I don't want to be." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in front of the fire while Thomas slept, and it was the most honest evening Clara had spent in a very long time. March came in like the territory itself, bold and changing, and not entirely reliable. The snow began to soften at the edges. The days got longer in the way that is almost imperceptible at first, and then suddenly undeniable. Clara's class of 22 children began to show the particular restlessness of young creatures sensing the season turning, and she channeled it into a spring project. Each child was to choose a plant native to the Kansas prairie and present its properties and uses to the class by the end of the month. This produced 11 separate requests to borrow the botanical guide simultaneously, which she managed with a rotation schedule that Thomas himself designed, drawing a chart that Clara put on the wall and which he checked with the satisfaction of a very small administrator. Jessie came one Saturday in the first week of March with firewood and stayed through the afternoon. They walked to the edge of town where the land opened up, just walked, the two of them, in the greening March air with the wind doing what Kansas wind does, which is everything at once. They walked to where the prairie grass was beginning to show the first tentative flush of returning color, and stood there looking out at the vast, flat, extraordinary distance of it. "I could show you the ranch," Jessie said. "If you wanted to see it before," he stopped, Before I go, she finished for him gently. Yes, he said. I would like that, she said. They arranged it for the following Sunday. Jesse, Clara, and Thomas, an excursion. Thomas talked about it for the entire week at school with a level of excitement that suggested he understood its significance more clearly than either adult was fully comfortable with. The Sunday was cold but clear. Jesse came with the wagon, and Thomas was already in the back wrapped in 2 blankets like a small, distinguished bundle, eating an apple he had been saving for this purpose. The 12 miles north of Caldwell took them through the open prairie, through the particular light of a March morning that was thin and gold and ran across the flat land in long lines, and Clara sat beside Jesse on the bench and watched the landscape move past her and felt something in her chest that was perilously close to belonging. The ranch was modest, a main house that was solid and well kept, a barn that was larger, a series of corrals where 12 horses stood in various attitudes of winter patience. There were 2 ranch hands, older men named Pete and August, who greeted Clara with the careful respect of people who had been told to be on their best behavior and were taking it seriously. There was the creek along the east pasture that Jesse had mentioned, running clear and cold under the remains of its winter ice. Inside the house, Clara noticed immediately that it was a house trying to be a home and not quite completing the project functional, clean, but sparse in the way of a place that has work in it but not quite life. There were Thomas's drawings on one wall, carefully pinned, which was the most personal thing in the main room. There were books in a crate beside the fireplace, well worn. There was a photograph on the mantel that she walked to look at, a woman with Jesse's coloring holding a small baby, both of them squinting in the sun. Ellen, Jesse said from just behind her. She looked like you, Clara said. She was better looking. She'd have told you that herself. Clara looked at the photograph for a moment. Ellen Calhoun, who had worked hard and come home and gotten sick and left a 7-year-old boy and a brother who was carefully carrying both of them forward with both hands. Thomas has her eyes, Clara said. He does, Jesse agreed, and his voice was soft. Thomas appeared in the doorway at this moment with a small brown dog he had apparently found in the barn. This is Pepper, he said. She lives in the barn, but I think she should live in the house. We've had this discussion, Jesse said. I think she should be in the house, Thomas repeated, looking at Clara with the specific expression of a child who has identified a potential ally. I think that's between you and your uncle, Clara said firmly, and Thomas accepted this with the equanimity of someone who is playing a long game. Jesse made coffee and Clara looked out the kitchen window at the east pasture and the creek line and the enormous, uninterrupted sky above the flat land, and she thought about something she had not let herself think about properly, what it would mean to be here. Not in the schoolteacher's 2-room house in town, but here, in this house that was trying to be a home. What it would mean to be the person who pinned Thomas's drawings on the wall and knew the names of the horses and watched the seasons move across this particular piece of prairie. She turned from the window. Jesse was watching her from across the kitchen with an expression that was careful and patient and absolutely not without hope. It's beautiful land, she said. It is, he agreed. I can see why you stay, she said. Can you see, he asked very quietly, why someone else might? The question lay between them like something that needed handling carefully. Clara thought about it honestly, the way she had promised herself she would always think about things. She thought about the difference between staying because of a man and staying because of a life. She thought about the schoolhouse with its 22 children and the way Thomas looked at the chart on the wall with administrative satisfaction. She thought about the 12 miles of prairie under the March sky. I'm starting to, she said. It was enough. It was not everything, but it was honest, and Jesse Calhoun understood honest better than he understood anything else. And so he nodded and handed her the coffee, and Thomas came back in with the dog, and the afternoon proceeded from there. The following 2 weeks were the weeks that changed things irreversibly, though not in a single dramatic moment. It was a series of ordinary things that turned out to be extraordinary. The Tuesday morning Thomas read aloud to the class for the first time without stumbling, clear and confident. And Clara looked up to find Jesse standing quietly at the back of the schoolroom, because he had ridden in from the ranch specifically to see this, which Thomas had told him was happening. And Jesse's expression in that moment was something Clara knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life, regardless of anything else. It was the Saturday afternoon when the first real warmth appeared in the sun, and they sat on her porch for the first time, the three of them. And Jesse whittled something shapeless and purposeful, while Thomas experimented with seeds he had saved, and Clara read aloud from Dickens, doing the voices, which made Thomas lose himself entirely in laughter, and Jesse forget to whittle. It was the evening Jesse stayed after Thomas had gone to bed at Mrs. Alderman's, and they stood on the porch of the schoolteacher's house in the newly warm dark and talked about everything for a very long time, and at the end of it he kissed her properly, not the careful first kiss of a question but the open, honest kiss of a man who knows the answer and is no longer being cautious about saying so. "I love you," he said, against her hair. "I know the timing is, I know what you said about spring. I'm not saying it to change anything. I'm saying it because it's true, and I can't seem to not say it." Clara stood in the circle of his arms with the March night around them, and every careful piece of her internal architecture rearranging itself. She had built so much to protect her own independence, and she understood now, standing here, that what she had been protecting it from was not love like this, but the kind of arrangement that masquerades as love while slowly erasing you. Jesse had never once tried to erase her. He had, in fact, spent 5 months being consistently interested in precisely who she was. "Jesse," she said. "You don't have to. I love you," she said. "I love you, and I have been trying not to because I told myself I was only staying until spring. And it turns out that was a more complicated arrangement than I understood when I made it." He was very still for a moment, and then he exhaled, long and slow, like a man who has been holding his breath for months. "What does that mean?" he asked. "For spring?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I'm not Jesse. I'm not counting down to leaving anymore. I don't know what I am counting, but it's not that." He held her tighter. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." April arrived. The school's spring term had 2 weeks left in it. The prairie was doing what the prairie does in April, an explosion of green and wildflower color that was almost shocking after the long brown of winter, the kind of beauty that seems to be making a point. Clara's students presented their plant projects with varying degrees of success, and Thomas's presentation on the wild indigo was so thorough and well illustrated. He had drawn the plant himself, carefully labeled, that even the oldest students listened with respect, which was not something the oldest students typically offered the youngest ones. Clara had written to the hiring committee in Denver. She had written to the family in St. Louis. She had written to Margaret. She had not told Jesse about any of these letters, and then one evening when he asked her plainly what she was thinking about, she told him all of it. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "What do you want? Not what makes sense, not what you planned. What do you want?" Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. "I want to stay," she said, "but I need to understand what staying means. I'm not Jesse. I can't be someone who just folds herself into another person's life and disappears. I need the school. I need work that's mine. I need to be Clara Hutchins who teaches, not just Clara Calhoun who keeps house," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only understanding. "I know," she studied him. "You do know, don't you?" "I know because you told me about your mother," he said. "And because I've watched you for 5 months and I've never once seen you be anything other than completely yourself, and I don't want a different version." He was quiet for a moment. "The school isn't going anywhere. Mr. Boone has been trying to figure out how to ask you to stay on for the fall term, which I know because he told me he was planning to ask and wanted to know if I thought you'd be open to it. I told him to ask you himself." Clara blinked. "When was this?" 3 weeks ago." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. 3 weeks. "I didn't want to. I was afraid it would feel like pressure. Like I was using the school as a reason to. I wanted you to choose this because you wanted it, not because it was convenient." He was looking at her with the full sincerity that was his most characteristic quality. "I want you to choose this, but I want you to choose it for yourself." She understood then, completely, what made him different. He had spent 5 months being afraid she would leave and had still, consistently, made sure she had every freedom to go. He had wanted her to stay badly enough to help her reasons to leave dry up on their own, and he had done it without manipulation, only by being the honest, steady, complicated, imperfect, extraordinary man he actually was. "Jesse Calhoun," she said. "Clara Hutchins," he said and smiled. "I want to stay." He looked at her for a long moment like a man verifying that something wonderful is actually real. Then he said, "Then stay." It was not quite a proposal. It was something better. It was permission and invitation and desire all at once, and Clara felt it settle into her like the first real warmth of spring settles into the ground, deep and transformative and not temporary at all. She went to see Mr. Boone the next morning, and told him she would like to discuss continuing through the fall term. He turned such a violent shade of pleased red that she worried briefly about his health, then offered her the same modest salary and the continued use of the house, and she accepted, and walked home in the April sunshine feeling the strange, wonderful lightness of a decision that is right. She went to Jesse with the news that evening. He was at the porch of the schoolteacher's house, which he had apparently ridden into town specifically for. She could see his horse at the post, and he was standing in the golden late afternoon light with his hat in his hands, and he looked like every better version of himself all at once. "I heard from Boone," he said, which meant someone had told him already because that was Caldwell. "Good news travels," she said, stopping in front of him on the porch. "The best news," he said, and his voice was lower, quieter than usual, with all the careful management stripped out of it. He put the hat on the post beside him, and both his hands were free, and he took one step toward her on the narrow porch and said, "Clara Hutchins, would you do me the enormous honor of marrying me?" It was not a question in its delivery, but it was entirely a question in its heart, and she could see everything he was in it. The frightened love of a man with a dead sister's son and 12 miles of prairie, and a house trying to be a home and a broken nose and a brown dog he wouldn't let inside, and a copy of Jane Eyre his mother had kept, and 5 months of firewood deliveries turned into 5 months of coffee turned into 5 months of falling irrevocably in love. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes."
Yes.
He kissed her there on the porch in front of Caldwell, Kansas in the April sunshine, and somebody across the street definitely saw it, because that was Caldwell too, and by supper the whole town knew, and Thomas arrived from school to find them sitting on the porch still, and he assessed the situation with the collected wisdom of a 7-year-old and said, "Finally," in a tone that suggested he had been waiting considerably longer than was reasonable. "You were in on this," Clara told him. "I told Ruth in November," he said, completely unrepentant, and went inside to find Pepper, the dog who did not live in the house. They were married in June, when the prairie was in its full summer extravagance, the wildflowers doing everything they could, the sky that particular Kansas blue that goes on forever in every direction. The ceremony was at the church, officiated by Reverend Hart, attended by most of Caldwell and all of the schoolchildren, who had been promised the day off school as a result of this event, and were therefore deeply invested in its success. Clara wore a dress Margaret had sent from Denver, cream-colored, practical, beautiful, and Jesse wore his good coat and the white shirt, and a tie he had borrowed from Mr. Boone that was slightly too short and which he adjusted 3 times during the ceremony. Thomas was the one who carried the ring, which he did with the gravity of someone performing a function of significant historical importance, and Ruth, who had been allowed to come as Thomas's guest, watched the whole thing with enormous satisfaction. When Reverend Hart said the words and Jesse took her hand and looked at her with everything he had ever tried to hold back now fully on his face, Clara thought, "I said I was only staying until spring." She thought it without grief or irony, only with the particular joy of having been wrong about something in the very best possible way. They moved into the ranch house in July, though Clara kept close ties with the school, which was by then assured to continue through the next term with her at the head of it. The ranch house transformed, gradually and with intention, into the home it had been trying to be. Thomas's drawings were joined by curtains Clara sewed, and a proper kitchen garden she started behind the house, and the crate of books expanded into a shelf Jessie built on the east wall, wide enough for the complete Shakespeare and the Dickens, and the natural science volumes and Jessie's growing collection of farming guides and range management texts that he read in the evenings with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Pepper, the barn dog, moved into the house in August, which was technically Thomas's victory, but which Jessie accepted with such graceless good humor that Clara found it unreasonably endearing. Thomas built her a bed from scrap wood, with some guidance from August the ranch hand, and the bed was lopsided and magnificent, and Pepper used it approximately twice before relocating to the foot of Thomas's actual bed, which was the arrangement all parties had implicitly expected from the beginning. That first fall, Clara went back to school, and her class had grown to 28 children. She negotiated with Mr. Boone for a second room to be added to the schoolhouse for the following year, and she wrote a careful and comprehensive curriculum proposal that she presented at the town meeting in October, and the town voted to fund it, which felt like winning something important. Jessie attended this meeting and sat in the back and watched her stand at the front of the room and argue for her students with complete command of her material and her audience, and afterward he walked home with her in the autumn night and said, "You're magnificent," with a simplicity that left no room for modesty. "I know," she said, which made him laugh, which was one of her favorite sounds. The winter was different from the last one, same cold, different warmth. Coming home to the ranch in the evenings to find Jessie and Thomas, and the permanent negotiated chaos of a working family, felt like arriving at something she had always been trying to find. She taught through the week and rode back to town with Jessie on Saturdays. He came in every Saturday as he always had, but now it was to bring her to town rather than to bring her wood, and the distinction felt like a kind of poetry, and she saw her students and her colleagues and the town that had become hers by choice, which was the best way to acquire anything. In the spring of 1881, exactly 2 years after Clara Hutchins had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell with a carpetbag and a plan to leave, she told Jessie she was expecting their child. They were at the kitchen table, the way they were most evenings, Thomas doing his schoolwork across from them, Pepper asleep at his feet, the stove doing its job, the lamplight over everything. She told him simply because she did not know any other way to do anything important. Jessie put down the range management text he had been reading. Thomas, who had not quite been paying attention, said, "What?" Jessie looked at Clara with the full force of his happiness, which was considerable and visible and completely unguarded. "We're going to have a baby," he said to both of them. Thomas put down his pencil. He processed this for a full 5 seconds in the thorough way he processed everything. "Will it sleep in my room?" he asked. "No," Jessie and Clara said simultaneously. "Because Pepper's already in my room," Thomas explained reasonably. "We understand," Clara said. Thomas picked up his pencil. "All right," he said. "I'll teach it things." And he went back to his arithmetic with the serene confidence of someone whose plans have been confirmed. Jessie reached across the table and took Clara's hand. She looked at him, at this man she had nearly left, at this life she had nearly not chosen, at this kitchen in this house on 12 miles of prairie that had become so entirely hers that she could not now remember what she had thought she was going toward when she had planned to leave. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "Since November." "October," she corrected. He looked surprised. "You knew in October." "I knew something in October," she said. "I loved you by November. You were significantly slower." "I was cautious," he said with dignity. "You were terrified." "Same thing," he said, and she laughed, and Pepper lifted her head at the sound, and Thomas looked up briefly with the tolerant affection of someone accustomed to the company of people who find each other funny, and the lamplight sat over all of it warm and steady. Their son was born in December 1881, in the first weeks of winter, in the ranch house that had once been trying to be a home and was now entirely one. He was healthy and loud, and had Jesse's dark hair and Clara's gray eyes, and a temperament that announced itself immediately as opinionated. They named him William, for Clara's father, and the whole household reorganized itself around this small new fact with the completeness that only a new baby produces. Thomas, at 9 years old, took his role as older brother with the seriousness he brought to all important projects. He read to William in the evenings with a diligence that went well beyond necessity, operating on the theory, apparently, that early exposure to quality literature was an investment that would pay dividends, which was a theory he had absorbed from Clara and was now applying independently. Jesse watched this and shook his head in fond wonder. Clara returned to teaching in February, when William was 8 weeks old and Mrs. Alderman had agreed to watch him during school hours, and the return felt like coming back to another part of herself, the part that stood at the front of a room and built understanding in young people, the work that had been hers before anything else. Jesse drove her to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon for the first month, and then she told him firmly that she was capable of riding herself, which was true, and he agreed and looked very slightly bereft about it for approximately 1 day before returning to his normal equilibrium. The second room was added to the schoolhouse that spring, with a second teacher hired from Wichita. Clara became the head teacher, which came with a modest increase in salary and a significant increase in administrative responsibility that she handled with the efficiency of someone who once devised a book-borrowing rotation schedule that 9-year-old Thomas had made into a wall chart. That summer, Calvin Dre came to the ranch with a basket of vegetables from his garden and sat on the porch and drank coffee with Clara and Jesse in the long evening light, and told them that he was finally going to go live with his daughter in Abilene, and that he was selling his property, and that he wanted Jesse to have the first offer. The land was 80 acres adjoining Jesse's north pasture, good creek access, and Calvin's price was honest. Jesse looked at Clara and Clara looked at Jesse, and the conversation that passed between them in that look contained the full agreement, and Jesse shook Calvin's hand and the deal was struck. The Calhoun operation expanded. Pete and August stayed on, and Jesse hired a third hand in the fall, a young man from Oklahoma named Daniel who was quiet and capable and taught Thomas to fish with an improvised pole during the slow parts of the day, which Thomas considered an invaluable supplement to his formal education. William's first word, to everyone's general amusement, was dog, delivered with clarity and conviction at 10 months old while looking directly at Pepper, who received it with royal composure. His second word was more, in reference to food, and his third word, delivered on a winter morning while Jesse was eating breakfast, was Papa, which produced in Jesse Calhoun an expression that Clara had to write about immediately in the letter to Margaret she had been composing, because it was the kind of thing that deserved witnessing. By the spring of 1883, William was 16 months old and conducting himself through the world with the physical confidence of someone who has only recently discovered walking and is very impressed by it. Thomas was 10 and had become, with Clara's encouragement and support, an extraordinary student who was already reading 2 years above his age and who had developed, with no particular assistance from anyone, a methodical interest in botany that had evolved from his school project into a careful ongoing journal of the plants along the ranch's creek, sketched and labeled and annotated. Clara looked at this journal sometimes and felt the particular pride that is not quite parental but is not quite anything else either, the pride of watching someone become, fully and completely, themselves. Jesse's ranch was doing well by the metrics that mattered in 1883 Kansas. The cattle were healthy, the land was good, the expanded operation gave them security they had not had before. He was 30 years old, which he noted with philosophical equanimity, and Clara told him he looked better at 30 than he had at 26, which he said was an improvement from "you look fine," and she said it was. The injustice of the times was not invisible from where they stood. The Kishom Trail that had made Caldwell prosperous ran through land that had been wrested from the Cheyenne and the Comanche and the Kiowa through a combination of broken treaties and military force. And Clara taught her children the full history, not only the settlement narrative, but the displacement that had made it possible, because she believed that understanding required the whole picture, even when the whole picture was uncomfortable. Jesse supported this, having grown up watching the systematic diminishment of the tribes who had once moved freely across the territory he now called home, and he had a particular and long-standing discomfort with the casual cruelty that many settlers exhibited toward any person who was not white and Protestant, and from the East, a discomfort that expressed itself in the practical language of a man who shows what he believes by what he does. He paid his hands fairly, he dealt honestly in his business, and he told his nephew plainly that being decent to people was not optional. Margaret and her husband visited in the summer of 1883, making the journey from Denver by rail. The trains had changed the distances considerably by then, and Denver was no longer the impossibly far destination it had felt 4 years earlier. Margaret was 40 years old and beautiful and sharp in the way Clara had always admired, and her husband Franklin was a mild-mannered merchant who clearly adored her and knew himself to be the less interesting party in the marriage, which he appeared to accept with good grace. Margaret stood in Clara's kitchen the first morning and looked at her sister over the rim of a coffee cup and said, "You look like someone who is exactly where they're supposed to be." Clara looked around the kitchen at the herbs she had dried and hung by the window, at William's cup on the lower shelf where he could reach it, at Thomas's latest botanical sketches pinned to the wall beside the door, at the shelf of books in the stove doing its work in the rectangle of Kansas summer sky through the window above the garden. "I do," she said. "Because I am." Margaret smiled. "The letter about the cowboy," she said. "I saved it." "You described a man you were clearly already in love with and spent 3 paragraphs explaining why you weren't." "I was not that obvious." "You described his eyes as the color of good coffee on a cold morning," Margaret said. "You were that obvious." Clara conceded this with a laugh. Jesse and Franklin got along with the comfortable ease of 2 men who share no interests but possess common sense and goodwill, which is the foundation of more good friendships than people acknowledge. Franklin was interested in the cattle business and asked specific questions that Jesse answered with care. And Jesse was interested in the rail business that was reshaping the Kansas economy, and Franklin had good information about it. And by the end of the visit, they had shaken hands on a loose arrangement for Franklin to inquire about cattle buyers in Denver who might be interested in establishing a more direct supply line, which was exactly the kind of practical outcome that resulted from marrying someone from a good family, though Clara would have done it regardless. Thomas turned 11 that autumn and had outgrown everything the Caldwell School could offer him, which was a conversation Clara had with Jesse with equal measures of pride and difficulty. There was a school in Wichita, a proper academy, that accepted students his age and provided the kind of education that Thomas's mind required and deserved. It was not a simple choice. Thomas had been through enough loss, and the idea of sending him away even to a good school raised in Jesse the old fear that had never fully left, the fear of not being enough, of losing someone else. But Jesse talked to Thomas, really talked to him, honestly, the way he talked to everyone he loved. He explained the school and what it offered, and then he said simply, "What do you want to do?" Thomas thought about it for 2 full days. Then he came to the kitchen where Jesse and Clara were both sitting and said, "I want to go, but I want to come home for Christmas and summer." "That's what the school is set up for," Clara said. "And I want Pepper to still be in my room when I come back," he said, "even if she sleeps with William the rest of the time." Jesse said, with only the slightest roughness in his voice, She'll be in your room." Thomas went to Wichita in September of 1883, and Jesse drove him to the rail station in Caldwell, and Clara stood on the platform and hugged the boy who had walked into her schoolroom in November 4 years ago with a stone in his pocket and tears he was pretending weren't there. And he was taller now and steadier and so thoroughly himself that it was almost hard to look at without feeling overwhelmed by it. "Study everything," she told him. "Write to us every week." "Every week," he promised. He looked at Jesse, and Jesse pulled him in and held him, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything needed. Then Thomas picked up his bag and walked onto the train with his shoulders back, and he turned once at the door and raised a hand, and Jesse raised his back. The train left. Jesse stood on the platform for a long moment. Clara put her hand in his. "He's going to be extraordinary," she said. "He already is," Jesse said. His voice was steady. "He's been extraordinary since October of 1879, when a schoolteacher in a green wool dress told him he was ahead of where she expected." Clara looked at her husband on the train platform in the September light. "November," she said. "I told him that in November." Jesse looked at her sidelong. "October," he said. "You were not there in—" She stopped. "You were there in October." "I came by the school once in October," he said, "to check on him. You didn't see me. He was reading aloud and you were listening with this expression like—" He shook his head. "Like you'd found exactly what you were looking for." She had been, Clara realized. She had been and hadn't fully known it yet. "You stood in the door and watched for how long?" "Long enough," he said. She squeezed his hand. Completely inappropriate behavior for a man who had not yet introduced himself. "I introduced myself the next morning with firewood." "You did," she agreed. "Very strategic." He put his arm around her shoulders, and they walked off the platform together in the September sun, back toward the wagon and the road north, back toward the house and William toddling around its interior with Pepper in dutiful attendance, back toward the life that Clara Hutchins had arrived in with a carpetbag and a departure date and the firm intention of not staying. She had said she was only staying until spring. Jesse had started counting the days. But what he had not told her then, what she understood now completely, was that somewhere in the counting, he had stopped counting down and started counting up instead. Counting forward from November, from the morning he knocked on her door with an armload of firewood. Counting forward from the December evening, she laughed at something Thomas said about stars and wood. Counting forward from the Christmas gathering and the walk home through the night sky and the February street and the first kiss that was a question. Counting forward from every Saturday, every Thursday evening, every conversation that ran longer than it needed to because neither of them wanted it to end. And Clara, who had told herself she was counting down to leaving, had been doing the same thing without knowing it. Counting every day she stayed not as one less until departure, but as one more of something she had not expected and could not have planned for one more day of being known, of being chosen, of being exactly herself in a life that fit her the way good work fits good hands. The seasons moved as they do in Kansas, autumn into winter into the spring that had once been a deadline, and was now just the season that came after the cold, full of wildflowers and new grass and the smell of the prairie waking up. Spring 1884 came in with particular beauty, the creek along the east pasture running high and clear, the fields that Calvin Dre's 80 acres added to their land showing a good green, and Clara stood at the kitchen window in the morning light and watched Jesse come in from the early chores across the yard, and he looked up and saw her there and raised a hand, and she raised hers back. She was, by that spring morning, expecting their second child. William, who had recently turned 2, was conducting negotiations with Pepper over possession of a chewed stick in the yard, and the outcome appeared uncertain. Thomas had written from Wichita to say that he had been invited to join an advanced natural science study group, which Clara had read aloud at the supper table with the specific tone she reserved for excellent news, and Jesse had listened with his eyes bright and his supper getting cold. They were, in the full and complete sense, a family. Not the family either of them had planned, Not the life Clara had thought she was building when she packed her books into a trunk and boarded a stagecoach in St. Louis, but the truest thing she had ever made with her own choices, in a place she had chosen, with a man she had chosen, and who had chosen her back with the patient, steadfast, completely uncalculated love that turned out to be the only kind worth having. Jesse came through the door, stamping mud off his boots, and William abandoned the stick negotiation and ran toward him with the arms open, maximum velocity commitment of the very young and very devoted. And Jesse caught him and swung him up, and William shrieked with delight, and Pepper barked at the general excitement of it. And Jesse looked across the room at Clara at the window with the morning light behind her, and his eyes held everything. The November morning and the firewood and the coffee and the counting. All the days counted forward into this one day and all the days still ahead. Morning, he said. Morning, she said. Outside the window, the Kansas spring was doing everything it did, extravagant and golden and entirely itself. The wildflowers coming up through the prairie grass in colors that seemed to argue with the winter that had preceded them, insisting on their own irreplaceable existence. The sky was the blue that went on forever. The creek was running somewhere beyond the east pasture, cold and clear, over the same stones it had always run over, wearing them smooth in the patient way of water that knows it has time. Clara Hutchins, Clara Calhoun, stood at her kitchen window in her home on 12 miles of Kansas prairie, teaching through the week, loving through the rest, growing the life she had once nearly missed by planning to leave it, and the counting had long since become not a countdown but an abundance. A sum, accumulating daily, growing every morning she woke up in this house with this man and these children. Every evening the lamplight sat over the table and the books, and the ordinary extraordinary facts of this life that had turned out to be, against all her careful plans, exactly the one she had been trying to find. Their second son arrived in October of 1884, healthy and bright-eyed and immediately in possession of an opinion about everything, which his mother found both charming and unsurprising. They named him James, for Jesse's father not to honor the difficult version of the man, but to take the name back from the difficulty, to give it something better to mean. Jesse held the baby in the lamplight that first evening and looked at him with the full, steady, unhurried love of a man who is no longer afraid. And Clara watched him and thought that this was the thing she had been counting toward without knowing it, not the end of something, but the accumulation of it. Thomas came home for Christmas and held his baby brother with the careful competence of someone who had consulted a book about infants, which he had, and announced that James showed signs of strong curiosity and good visual tracking, which Clara said was an excellent assessment. And Jesse said that Thomas had been around Clara too long and was starting to sound like a teacher, and Thomas said there were worse things to sound like, which made Clara set down her knitting and look at him with a warmth she could not have expressed in words. They were all together in the ranch house on Christmas evening, Jesse and Clara and Thomas and William, toddling from chair to chair, and James in his cradle and Pepper triumphant at Thomas's feet, and the stove warm and the lamplight over all of it. And outside the prairie winter was doing its austere and beautiful work, the stars enormous in the clear cold sky, the same stars that had always been there. The ones the Romans had looked at, and Thomas had asked about on a December night in 1879, walking home between two people who had not yet admitted to themselves what was already true. Clara looked at her husband across the room, and he looked back at her, and between them was everything, the whole long history of a love that had begun as firewood and coffee, and a woman who said she was only staying until spring, and a cowboy who had started counting the days, not knowing yet that the days he was counting would become years, and the years would become a life, and the life would become this. The lamplight, the stove, the children, the prairie, the love that had turned out to be the most permanent thing in a world of temporary arrangements, Spring would come again in April, as it always did, and Clara Calhoun would still be there,